So this is a really nice Pioneer F950 deck. These were on sale in the late 1970s and sold into the early 1980s. These were reference decks. They are, this one in particular is a three-head deck, and what that means is that while you're recording, you can actually hear playback from the tape just after it has recorded. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. But I want to talk about this deck. It's a phenomenal deck. I used to sell these back in, as I said, the late 70s, early 80s. They were reference standard at the time, and this deck has been cleaned up and refurbished to the point that it is performing as well as I can ever remember these decks doing. So let's talk about the 950. So there were many in this series. There was the CTF 900. The 900 did not have the metal setting. The 950 introduced the metal setting for metal tapes. Now, that's not necessarily all that important these days, because even though you can still get used and you can get new metal tapes that are new in box, the difference between the later chromium dioxide formulations and the metal is very minimal. However, if you're a purist, this deck is made to be able to record on a metal tape as well as standard chrome or chromium dioxide high bias type 2 tapes. And there was a type 3 tape called a ferrochrome for a short period of time, and that's why it's still on this deck. That kind of tape was phased out pretty much after it got introduced, not too long. You can still find some on eBay. I don't recommend trying them. If you're going to do anything, just get a high bias tape, which is type 2, or of course type 4, which is the metal tapes, which are, as I said, readily available. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a recording so you can see what it sounds like, and you can see how it works. So we're going to start that now. What I'm going to do is press the play and I'm going to press the pause, play and record at the same time. Now I'm going to start music from YouTube right now. Now the way this is set is I'm listening to the tape, not the source. So what we're going to hear is what's actually being recorded on the tape. Right? Ready? Now, let's talk about this a little bit. We were listening to the recording that was actually being made on the tape. So what you were hearing was the recording was made and the tape was playing back right after the recording started. I'll switch it to source in a minute. You'll see we'll have to turn down the volume, but I'll show you how that works. We have a bias fine adjustment. Right now it's up in the middle, and I'm going to continue this play and record, and I'm going to adjust this. When I adjust it left, it's going to get brighter. When I adjust it right, it's going to get a bit more tone and warm sounding. So right now it's in the middle. As I said, I have my Dolby turned on. Notice the Dolby light, it's turned on. This only has Dolby B because of when it was released. That was all that was available. It does have a mic and a line input. We're using a line. I'm not using the microphones. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn over to source, but I'm not going to start recording. I want you to see what happens when I switch to source. This is a dual volume control, so the outer is controlling the left and the inner is controlling the right. So you can see I'm holding one, and you can see on the meters. So I'm going to set it so that they're about the middle. Now I'm going to start the recording again in a minute, but I want to talk about some other features. So this has, if you'll notice, of course you've got your counter reset, but you've got this memory, stop and play, or counter, stop and end, then off. Well, if I set this to repeat at the counter, when it goes back to 0, it's just going to start playing again. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Oh, sorry. So because I've got this on source, you're going to hear the music start immediately when I start to play it. It's not recording onto the tape. This is just coming through source, so nothing's happening on the tape right now. And I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to adjust it so that the peaks are around 5, and what I'm going to do is just put that peak hold on so that I can see, wow, they've gone up to 7, right? So I'm going to back it off a little bit. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to now start a recording. So I'm pausing this. I'm going to start this, and I'm going to start this over again. Now we're going to monitor the tape to see how it's sounding. Now it is a little lower. The output from the tape ends up being a little lower than the source, and that's okay. But this allows you to then adjust your bias, make sure it's sounding the way you want. You can adjust your input. You might overdrive the tape. This is why you use the source. But you can go ahead and add a little bit if you want to. Just be aware that you can overdrive the tape. That's why you want to do the setting at source. So make sure that on a metal tape your peaks really don't go above +5. Metal tapes can take a higher saturation. And then we're going to play this back. Okay. Remember how our counter works. We're going to put it on tape because now we want to listen to the tape. And then I'll turn it up. When we're playing it back, if you like it to sound brighter, You can put it on standard because this is just an equalization. And some people don't like to leave Dolby on playback, especially if they're playing it back at lower levels. Bias has no effect when it's not recording, so it doesn't matter where you have that set playing back. You have an output line control here, which will help if you're using headphones. So that should give you a really good indication of how it records and plays. Next up, we're going to take the top off and we're going to talk about all the things that were done to refurbish and clean up this deck. So when these get serviced, the main area of focus for servicing them involves the cassette mechanism itself. Largely because there are belts in the cassette mechanism that have broken sometimes or have become relaxed. Sometimes they have been exposed to temperatures that are so severe that they actually turn to almost a liquid. They liquefy, and that means that there's a lot of work that has to be done. The main part that goes bad on these decks. Now remember, this was made in 1978, 1979, and here we're in 2021. So we've got a few years on this now. We have this motor, which is the take-up reel motor that also handles the rewind and the fast forward. This motor tends to have to be rebuilt. Now, rebuilding the motor involves taking it apart and cleaning all of the contact mechanism components inside of it. The motors rarely are bad themselves, but the armature is usually dirty. The brushes, after 40 years of sometimes very hard use, sometimes just sitting around, they need a lot of work. The main motor that drives the capstan typically is in pretty good shape, but it oftentimes either has to have its speed adjusted, not necessarily on the motor, that's done on the board back here, but that's also done using a special meter called an oscilloscope, so that you can keep track of, what I do is I put a reference tape in and I play it and I bring it to the right speed. Now there are other areas that have to be serviced in these, and I'll talk about that as well. The various components that are adjustable are used to fine-tune the electronics. Now, in many of these systems, capacitors like these, CAN capacitors, you'll see them, they're all over, are bad or are out of spec. These are capacitors. And what you'll find is there are services that say they will change all the capacitors in the unit. And there is good and bad to that. The good is putting all new capacitors in means, and the capacitors themselves are the parts that really will wear over time and go out of spec. But that's a lot of work. There are over 100 capacitors in this, and not all of them actually need to be replaced. So what I will do is I will typically look at the circuit, run it through my oscilloscope, and if I determine that something's wrong in either of the stereo channels, that something might be wrong on one of these boards, then I'll troubleshoot the board. And I'll start with the capacitors. I'll look at the capacitors on the board and I will measure them. Typically, most of the capacitors are still perfectly fine in these units. Where you will find capacitors that do go bad, there it's very evident in the circuit. So it's easy usually to pinpoint. However, some of these units have gone out of specification just in a very minor way. And in this case, this one had where I had to adjust the potentiometer for the playbook output on the left channel just slightly to even it up. Not a lot of work. There are also potentiometers back here used to get the meter calibrated. I had to change that just slightly just to bring it into spec. Overall, the unit electronics were in very good shape, so not really much had to be done here. Most of the work was in repairing this motor, changing out all of the belts, and making sure that everything is properly lubricated and, by the way, put back properly. There's a spring here that's used to make sure that that static is relieved from the flywheel. Many times people will do repairs on these and will not put that back correctly. This unit had been repaired by somebody else at some point in time because the light that's behind the cassette mechanism has actually been converted to an LED. So that was done probably in the last 20 years. But they did it correctly, because when they did, they put in line a resistor into that circuit, and that's correct. That should have been done. So that was a good repair job that was done. But that was done some time ago. LEDs certainly have been around since the 70s, but the LED that they replaced it with looks like it might be a little newer. So this could have been repaired maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s. And that's it for what's going on inside the case. The other thing that I did have to do was seriously dust it out, because there was a lot of dust, and whoever has had it along the way had it looks like it was cat hair. So before you're seeing it here this way, it was chock full of dust. And the way you do that is you use a brush to just loosen the dust. You vacuum it out then with a vacuum on a hose, and then you blow it out with compressed air to make sure that it gets good and clean. And probably the last changes that were made were non-functional changes, but they are pretty important. When I took the face plate off, what I do is I take each of the buttons off and out, and anything else that is silver or shiny or would be shiny, because usually these have some kind of corrosion on them. And then what I do is I buff them down and clean them up. Now they're not perfect. They still look like they're not brand new, but they're shiny. Once again, they're clean. They certainly all work. That's another thing that I do, is I make sure that everything does work. And but they're nice and shiny again. I clean the whole faceplate. Now I can't repair very well a scratch if there were a big scratch here, and there isn't. Any scratches on brushed aluminum is very, very hard to take out. This one has a very nice face on it. I'm gonna move the camera so you can see the rest of it. The rest of the face is very nice. These were all taken off and polished. The door opens and closes really nicely. The pinch rollers and everything are very clean on the inside. They've been cleaned. There are some minor blemishes, and I'm going to show you the blemishes that are on the case as well. In some situations, these things have been pulled out of e-waste. So somebody, in this case, I think it was not, but some that I've picked up have scratches on them, and it's like they pulled them out of a dumpster, which is a shame. But this one's in really nice shape. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the inside mechanism where the cassette goes in just a moment. So the last thing I'll show you is a little bit about the transport mechanism. Now this is the record playback head. That's something that you need to make sure is clean. Remember, this is a dust cover. It's to keep dust and dirt from getting in there when you're not using the deck. This is the erase head. It needs to be cleaned as well. If it's not clean, then it won't erase the tape properly as it's being recorded. This is the take-up pinch roller, and the this is the feed pinch roller and capstan. This makes sure that the tape coming in is traveling across at a constant speed. It's a little slower than this one, calibrated particularly for that. This is the main capstan and pinch roller. You always keep these clean as best you can, and you can do that with a cotton swab and alcohol. Don't use anything other than alcohol on it. But this is the main mechanism. This is what you need to make sure that you keep clean. The tape head has had its azimuth properly set. If you notice, it's now locked with red paint. The azimuth means that the head is now properly calibrated to be perfectly tangent with the tape and the recording tracks. And that's it for this unit. The other thing that I did want to at least point out, and the last thing I'm pointing out, is that the light behind the cassette window, you'll see that light is not a warm glow because it was replaced. The bulb that's normally in here is an incandescent bulb, and quite frankly they last a very long time. This one must have burned out, and as I said, someone replaced it with an LED. They did a very good job of it, by the way, and this has a very nice glow so that you can see with a cassette in, you can see the amount of take-up that is left in that cassette. Here's an example so you can actually see really nicely how much time is left from the tape on the reel hubs. So that's a nice thing. And they did, as I said, they did a really good job. I did not replace that. I want you to listen to how quiet the mechanism is. Now you hear a ticking in the background. I have a wall clock. That's not coming from this. That mechanism is very smooth and very quiet. All right, so after attempting to end this about 5 different times and then remembering that there were some other things I wanted to show you, I'm going to bring this to an end. Well, I hope you like what you've seen. I hope that this serves you for many, many years to come. When you do get it, keep the box, keep the packing material, because eventually it will need to be sent off somewhere for service over its lifetime. These are bought as is. This is not returnable. It is sold as is, because I can't guarantee that a rectifier isn't going to go out next week. I can't guarantee that the rest of the electronics are going to work next week. I can tell you that for everyone that I've bought and serviced, and I've retained them for a period of time, I usually use them for a good month before I sell them to make sure that they are working properly. I haven't had any issues at all, not with the ones I've retained and not with the ones I've sold. So there you go. I hope this unit serves you well. This video will be handheld because I'm going to take you on a tour of the dents and issues with the cabinet. Now these cabinets were just simulated wood grain vinyl. There's nothing special about them, but they do get scratches and sustain issues. This obviously was really banged up on the side. You can see that's pretty nasty, but from a distance it doesn't look too bad. Another gouge down here, and up here right about there you can see a little crack in the veneer. I did glue it just to make sure that it wouldn't chip off, but I didn't do any other work to the veneer. Veneers are really hard to work with, and I was afraid I would make it worse. There's a little chip out over here. Doesn't look good. But when you back off on the unit, you'll notice that the further you get, the better it looks. The side panel is in pretty good shape. That looks pretty good. Can't complain about it. I did clean it. Does have a metal grate on the back. That does need to be kept open so that it can breathe. So whatever you do, don't put anything on top of that. That needs its vent. It needs to allow air in. And then on this side, I think it looks pretty good too. So overall, pretty good. These units came in both a simulated wood grain box like that, and they also came in a metal top, which I have on others. But this one has the nice wood grain. This has a very strong rewind. This is a 110-minute metal tape. And if I were to time this, which I am not, it's probably going to take about a minute, maybe a minute and a half to rewind that tape. And I'll let this go so that you can see how strong the take-up motor is now that it's been rebuilt. You can also hear how strong it is as it's rewinding. When you have a poor motor on that take-up side, the rewind motor, it will begin to labor as the left hub fills, or if you're fast forwarding, the right hub. So you can see that it's not having any trouble whatsoever.